So, without further ado, let me get started. And let's see. And so we'll ask the question, why study African cities? But first of all, this is an image of the town that I live in when I excavate the ancient site of Djenné. So this is a site of Djenné. It's got about 20,000 people. When you see the archaeological sites in this area that are classic tells, like the tells in Mesopotamia, imagine that this is what it would have looked like. This is the mosque at Djenné. It's the largest used adobe structure in the world today. So it very much gives you an image of what some of these cities may have looked like. But why do I say, why study African cities? And that's because I'm going to frame this in terms of what should my ex-graduate student, Mamadou Cissé, do when he excavates a city. Now Mamadou has, or Cissé we call him, has a problem. And that is that he's been working for about 10 years. He did his dissertation on a town called Gao. In French, it's Gao Ancien, ancient Gao. It's not on your handout. I'll show you where that is. But it's a big problem because at this point he's excavated about 10 hectares. So that's 24 acres. All urban, all architecture. You can see some of that in the back. He worked with me for about 20 years as one of my supervisors at the site of Djenné, and that's the image you see there. But we have no idea. We had no idea that a city was there. The radiocarbon dates are coming out 400 to about 900 AD. Now we knew that Gao was the capital of one of the major so-called medieval West African empires, the empire of Songhai from about the 15th century. We had no idea that there was a large city. Everywhere we go, either excavating, Cissé excavating, or using ground penetrating radar, we're finding the same massive structures. So I'm going to frame this talk in terms of three things that Cissé needs to do or needs to think about as he continues his studies. He's now the second in command of the Heritage Ministry in Mali, his home country. So he is really in charge of all of the archaeology being done in that country that has some of the earliest and most original urbanism in sub-Saharan Africa. So here's the position of Gao. It's so you can locate it on your handout. So one question is, how should Cissé excavate what we're going to be calling an assembled city? A shorter way to talk about that is, how should Cissé dig? When he's dealing with a city like that has no reference at all in history, we have and it really doesn't look like any of the other towns in the country that we've been excavating. How does he, just on a practical basis, how does he proceed with the excavation? Second question, can he ignore the rural neighbors? So, although Gao Ancien is in the modern town of Gao, as you go down the Niger River, there are large tells and large scatters. This happens to just be a scatter. But this was an ancient settlement, probably lasted about 500 years. I'm going to estimate that we've got about 3 or 4 meters of deposits there. But it's very close. I mean, it's literally, in some of these cases, it's spitting distance from each of these settlements. Again, we had no inkling that this wealth of settlements was along the Niger River. So in order to answer that question in a more abbreviated form, can he ignore the rural neighbors? How should Cissé look at the city's hinterland? And finally, what's the equation of Cissé's massive structure with what we had always thought, and certainly when I started out in the mid-70s in West Africa, we thought there should be some kind of a state, if not a despotic state, but some kind of a hierarchical organization of labor and of people behind the foundation of the city. So we have three questions then. How should Cisse shake off the dead hand of old theory? I'm kind of giving myself away in that case. How should he look at the hinterland, and how should he dig? So let's go through. So there was a time, and that's breaking down, but it's still there in the back of the minds of most archaeologists, that a despotic state is coincident with, if not a prerequisite for urbanism. And that's something that's breaking down in the Near East as well as many other places. But I'll just make the assertion that it's because of this idea that we have this presumption that it's really most interesting to excavate original urban situations. In other words, where in the world you find cities without influence from other urban situations. In some ways it's lesser, in some ways it's not as interesting for archaeologists to work on places that had demonstrable evidence of influence from the outside. The effect of that is about 90% of the Earth's surface was ignored by classical urban archaeologists like myself because there was no written record of contact with these other areas. So it's now that places like Southeast Asia, now that the slip side of the Amazon, of the Andes, the Amazonian side of the Andes. Now that sub-Saharan Africa is open to a different kind of archaeologists, that we're finding a greater diversity of cities, again, without any evidence of contact from the well-established 6 original cores of urbanism. We'll come to that in the end. So cities were supposed to, in their layout, in the material culture, in the architecture, in some way reflect the hierarchical structure of society and also the hierarchical distribution of power. I gave you 2 readings to read in advance, and certainly the one by Carlos Anopoli and myself emphasizes the power presumptions of urbanism. I'm not really going to talk about that too much, except to say that this is a classic depiction of a hierarchy with a chief or a king on top, with an elite. The elite have a function of distributing the decisions of the king down through the populace, and they act as gatekeepers, keeping information, irrelevant information, if you will, from going from the base up to the top. But there was always a presumption by urban archaeologists like myself that you would find architectural reflections of this structure in the city, and it may not surprise you that generations of urban archaeologists were more interested in the seats or the citadels of the kings or the chiefs, and until recently less interested in the diversity of the population. So we look for things like monuments, religious monuments. We look for things like city walls as reflections of the power structure of the town. But what if you had situations, and we know we have many in the world now, what if you had a situation where even if there was a king, and the king may be very, very hard to find, that the classic despotic hierarchical organization is maybe evident, maybe was never really relevant to the founding of the city or the functioning of the city. So I'm going to over and over come to Tel Brak. It's in some cases spelled B-R-A-K, but it's one of these classic cities in northern Syria that has several generations of archaeologists thinking in different ways about Tel Brak. Started with excavations by Sir Max Mallow in the 20s, I believe, a very traditional approach to Tel Brak. Continuing excavations by Joan and David Oates at Cambridge, and this is why I call Tel Brak with a C rather than a K because they insisted on spelling it that way. But they were kind of in a transition. They started their careers as traditional urban Mesopotamian archaeologists, and yet as time went on over their long career at Cambridge and their long career of excavating or thinking about being exposed to non-traditional, non-despotic cities, they started to think about it in a different way. And I'll be ending up in talking about how some of the work from the assembled or clustered cities in West Africa have conversations with myself and others with the present excavator, who's Jason Orr at Harvard, has changed his approach to looking at the city, looking at the founding of the city, and we have a very different Tel Brak now because of that. But let me show you our first African city, which is Great Zimbabwe. And probably everyone here has some familiarity with Great Zimbabwe, the ideology behind Great Zimbabwe. But it certainly was the case that right from the very beginning, when the butchers who excavated the site first, and I really shouldn't reward their efforts with they were basically mining the site for gold. There wasn't much gold, but by the time the first legitimate archaeologist gets to the site, who was Gertrude Caton Thompson in 1928, there were no deposits left anywhere in the big structure of Great Zimbabwe. So she was reduced to looking at the spoils heap. So as you go through the material, you make great big mounds of inverted materials. In other words, the older stuff is up on the top. So she would go through, she reconstructed what's pretty close to what we know now as the true story of Great Zimbabwe. Doing the reverse stratigraphy. But right from the very beginning, the excavators who were part of the colonial administration in what was then southern Zimbabwe had a problem. This looked like it should be the capital of a king. But it was part of the colonial ideology that there shouldn't have been kings at the time. So there was all this neat nonsense about this being a trading outpost of the Queen of Sheba, and the Phoenician kings came down here and had hived off empires and whatnot. It was very clear from the pottery, which is very similar to the present-day Shona, the pottery of the present-day Shona period, that this was all nonsense. But this was a major part of the idea. But continuing, now that we understand more about Great Zimbabwe and about its founding in the middle of the 13th century, there was still the idea that there had to have been a developed state, if not despotic, then some kind of an elite, that the architecture of Great Zimbabwe, whether the, let's see if I can find, whether the hilltop enclosure, which is supposed to be where the king in the western enclosure and the queen in the eastern exposure, or in the great enclosure down, so this is a view of the great enclosure from the hilltop. Early archaeologists couldn't make sense of the great enclosure. Clearly monumental architecture. We now believe that it's a place for initiation rituals for kids coming in from communities from a vast area in present-day Zimbabwe. But there was still this idea that it really should reflect some kind of a hierarchical state organization. Now, this is Innocent Pikiriri. When in 2001, I was brought into Pretoria, University of Pretoria, which was the trademark apartheid university in South Africa. The archaeology department was a mess, and it's probably in academic terms, it's called taking a department into receivership. So my first year, I had to fire all of the staff. The second year, I had to rehire staff. My first hire was the professor or the head of department, which is Innocent Pikiriri. Now, Innocent wrote the book on the Great Zimbabwe Society. He is Zimbabwean himself, which means there's a little bit of tension between himself and the South African and the black South African elites. So Innocent is in the position of trying to kind of pull back on this idea that Great Zimbabwe and another site I'll show you in a moment were reflections of a fully established state. The problem with that is that it's part of the ideology of the ANC, that Great Zimbabwe and the earlier site, Mapungubwe, were capitals of the state, and so they've got a black Zimbabwean pulling back on what is now state ideology. It gets a little more complicated. So here's Great Zimbabwe here in the middle of Zimbabwe, right on the Limpopo River, which is where I do a lot of my work. There's a number of complicated sites, complex sites, especially this one. This is Mapungubwe. The state ideology now in South Africa is that Mapungubwe was the seat of the first state in sub-Saharan Africa. And here you see the excavations from the University of Pretoria in the 20s of a number of so-called royal burials, individuals, probably high-status individuals, we can tell from their health, but also they had hundreds of thousands of gold beads, trade items coming in from the Swahili coast, and then the presumption was that the commoners lived at declining status away from the citadel itself. Well, when those excavations started, it was clear that there was no correlation at all between spatial distance from the citadel and the status. It seems to be that the plateau was surrounded by different craft organizations, craftsmen. So you have ceramicists, you have iron workers living in different quarters, if you will. This will become a pattern that's very, very familiar. Now, I just wanted to emphasize how really fraught this is. This is the classic illustration of the ideology of archaeology as taught in Pretoria, one of the Afrikaner universities, why the department was in such a mess with the ending of Pretoria. They basically taught that when the Dutch arrived at Cape Town in 1652, there were a number of Bantu-speaking tribes just waiting. They may have been waiting there for centuries, just waiting to cross the Limpopo. The moment the Dutch put their foot on the shore at Cape Town, then they start to move across the Limpopo. So by the time the Boers, or the Afrikaners, reached this area as part of the Great Trek in the 1838, they had really just come across the river. They hadn't established themselves. So in other words, Pretoria, Johannesburg, all this area here, the Durban and the whole of the Cape was unoccupied territory. Now we know archaeologically that's just nonsense, but that was the kind of archaeology that was taught at Pretoria, and the secret government of South Africa under apartheid was the Broederbond, the band of brothers. The professor of archaeology had a permanent seat on the 8-member Broederbond. So important was the archaeology to the ideology of apartheid. So, I mean, obviously, things have changed, and renewed excavations at places like Mapungubwe and a number of other satellite sites are part of rewriting this whole idea. And despotism doesn't really seem to have much of a role in our new understanding. Just another example of the, if you will, the tyranny of this kind of idea. This is artist reconstruction of Memphis. Many, not all, but many Egyptologists are calling cities like Memphis theater cities, basically saying that for most of the year, there are very few people at Memphis. The town would fill up like a bellows at ceremonial moments. This was a theater, this was a stage for these, for the processions and whatnot, and then people would leave, particularly for the agricultural season. Well, that may be the case, but when archaeologists in the turn of the 20th century, and through most of the 20th century, went down the river, down to the south, into what now is the Sudan Republic. They found sites that really didn't fit their conception of what was going on. And one is Kerma. So the first, George Reisner, the first excavator, saw the big structure, what we call the Dufifa, thought it was a pyramid, excavated as it was a pyramid. I don't really know that there's anything left for excavators because of the kind of the butchery. And actually, George Reisner was a very, very good archaeologist for the time. But there was a series of structures all around, clearly a town, very large area. He just couldn't deal with it. It looked like an African village or 1,000 African villages just plopped next to this structure. Now George Reisner, clearly thought that it was the Egyptians who came in either through diffusion of ideas or actual colonists, actual settlers who created something that looked like their pyramids, and then perhaps that became an attraction, a magnet point for the local people. Well, there have been 20 years now of excavations by the Swiss, and we now have an idea that the Dufifa was some kind of a religious structure, there's no question about that, but they're more interested in the beginnings from this about 6,000 BC to the heyday at about 3,000 BC of this, what would you call it? If you're thinking in terms of despotic hierarchical organization, this is certainly not organized in a way that you would imagine. Charles Bernet's hypothesis, and I completely agree with him, is that this, for some reason, for some religious reason that goes back into the middle of the Holocene, was an attractive point seasonally for different pastoral clans to come, clans known to the Egyptians as the sea people, not SEA, but the sea group. And they would come periodically, seasonally, and this may have had a very small population for part of the year and a very large population seasonally. And this assembled, if you will, organization reflected what was going on. Now we have a couple other examples of that. The claimed earliest city in Peru, on the west coast of Peru, just south of Lima, is Caral. And this is, clearly massive amounts of labor went into the construction of Caral. But as far as we know, for most of the year, no more than about 100 people, priests, lived at Caral. But for the high ceremonial season, thousands of people came in. They were organized not by any despotic kind of king, but by their religious beliefs to keep adding to this massive, great structure. So I think there's a better chance that Caral and the Peruvian analog is the better explanation for what's going on at Kerma than the old despotic message. So to get back to Mamadou Cissé, how should Cissé shake off the dead hand of old theory? Is the city an artifact of the state? Oops. One more. Yep, okay. Lesson one. Perhaps some more. Perhaps Great Zimbabwe at its heyday was the reflection of a state. But the majority of African cities that we know now were not the seat of a despotic ruler. So if your excavation techniques are driven by your assumption that you'd have a hierarchy of architecture, a hierarchy of material culture, reflecting the hierarchy of power distribution in the town, you've clearly got to rethink your excavation techniques in this case. So, what should Cissé do? How should Cissé excavate? So we have this curious structure at Kerma, but we have another example later in time, starting about in the 15th century in Nigeria. And Benin City, that I'll be talking about, is just one of many. We call it the Yoruba model, the traditional Yoruba model of cities, but it clearly has spread to many other people in forested West Africa than just the Yoruba. So one of the curious things about Benin City is that we've always known that and there was a king in later times, the king's compound was surrounded by these enormous great walls and ditches. And some of the first things the British did when they conquered the city in the 1898 was try to walk and map, the British being good surveyors, tried to map this structure. So this is Benin City today. Benin City today. A later archaeologist, British archaeologist right at independence, mapped all of this. He spent his entire career just mapping this part. We now have the same kind of cellular structure of these great big ditches covering this whole entire area here. Maybe a tenth is properly mapped. So you can see a very 20 meters between 20 meters between the height of the bank and the bottom of the ditch. So an enormous reserve of labor must have gone into the building of this. Only 2 parts of the wall have been sectioned, and none of the settlements within the cellular structures have been excavated at all. So all of that effort by archaeologists just to get a plan of the cellular structure. So if you remember the map of Kerma, how it looked like a cluster or an assemblage of different things, this seems to be going on in Benin City as well. Very different, however, this is Nippur, from the air, very different from our classic Mesopotamian cities, where you have a city wall. Basically, because of internecine warfare between the cities, you had a more or less depopulated hinterland, rural area between, and all the population was packed in designated places, and the archaeologists have tended to work on the religious structures and the palatial structures. So in other words, those parts of the architecture and city planning which should reflect the higher end of the hierarchy. And that was very much, here's Tel Brak again, very much the story of the excavations, Max Mallowan and then the Oates of Tel Brak. We're going to see a very, very different Tel Brak in just a little while. But I wanted to show you another one of these assembled cities or clustered cities. We don't really know if they're cities. They're certainly large enough to be cities. Probably it's hard to imagine on analogy with pastoral people in the Sahara and also in South Africa now, that some of these, if all of these structures were occupied, and most of the space would have been used for cattle, but if all these structures were occupied, then you wouldn't have as many as 40,000, 45,000 people at one point. Now, this is a part of Mauritania called Tishit. It's a great big arcing escarpment that surrounds an old an old massive lake. And this goes on, you find these structures for over 650 kilometers along the escarpment. So just a couple of those images. So this is the escarpment around this old lake. There's Tishit, Gao that we've talked about, and we're going to be coming back. We'll see a relationship between Tishit and Timbuktu and Jenny. So it's a time when the Sahara was wet. There were large lakes. Lake Chad, which is the largest lake now, was 10 times the size, over 1 million square kilometers of surface area. This would have been the lake here, so this is a little misleading. But we're on the lake here, looking up at the escarpment, at the cliffs, and all along the cliff top, and in some cases along the slip slope, you find these structures. Some of them are fairly compact. This may have had 500 people, 1,000 people, with many cattle. Some of them are very long. You're looking at about 2 kilometers across here, with large pens for cattle. Okay, and some of them are very large indeed. This is what they look like on the ground. So this is not just a couple of rocks outlining the cattle pens and the houses. This would have represented an enormous amount of labor. So we think this begins. The excavation has been a little bit spotty. We think this begins somewhere in the 6th millennium BP, before the present, and by about 1000 BC, it's basically abandoned. The lake has dried out and it's been abandoned. Now it's almost certain that this was occupied by pastoralists, so it may have been very similar to what we think is going on at Kerma. Certain parts of the year, the whole community is reassembled at the town, and then other parts of the year, at least the young men go off with the cattle, and it's a very typical transhumant system. But even if all of these ruins, and we've documented 20,000 of these in that arc of over 600 kilometers. Even if they weren't all occupied at the same time, it still represents an enormous population. Now, our analogy is from similar behavior amongst pastoralists in East Africa and especially in South Africa. So some of the work my Pretoria students are doing in South Africa is looking at structures. Now this happens to be Shaka's enclosure at the beginning of his career, but it's organized in a way, the archaeology of Shaka's corral and the earlier corral is clearly very similar to what we're finding at Tisha. And these are some of my students at Pretoria, all of whom are digging different examples of these kinds of enclosures. So we started Dar Tishit, and from there, 600 kilometers down to there, hundreds of these. And I would just, if you have nothing, if you have insomnia tonight, go on Google Earth, find Tishit. You can find, there's a village of Tishit, about 200 people. Find Tishit and just follow that arc. And this is the sort of thing you'll see. This is a massive Great One, close to some of my excavations in this part of Mali. Here's another long, that's about 4 kilometers. So again, as an archaeologist, the issue is, were all of these compounds occupied at the same time, or did people come back year after year, occupying the same general area, but it's the classic palimpsest problem for archaeologists. And we won't know that until there are lifetimes of excavations by young archaeologists like Cissé. But that phenomenon leads to Timbuktu, the classic Timbuktu. Timbuktu itself, as far as we know, is a fairly recent town. Probably 11th century, maybe to some of you 11th century doesn't seem recent, but compared to what we found in the hinterland. So there's Timbuktu here, here's the Niger River. And starting in the mid-'80s, and then with my graduate students in the 2007, we've done a number of surveys of an old defunct waterway, what's called a wadi, that goes 300 kilometers up into the Sahara. So from the wet period of West African prehistory, there are at least a dozen of these wadis going up, and they would have fed water from the Niger or the Senegal River into these massive Great Lakes covering the Sahara. But you can't walk the banks of those wadis without stepping on late Stone Age or Neolithic material or Iron Age material. So this is one of the sites that I excavated. There's only 25 hectares. So that's 64 or so 8 acres. A graduate student, Doug Park, looked at this, and This is actually one continuous site. It's been cut through by the river. Actually, grew up along the river, and Timbuktu is an area of moving dunes. So you come to the site at one point, and there's clearly an archaeological site, can be up to 5 meters high. The next season you come in and the wind has blown over it and you can't find that part of the site. But after several seasons and a dissertation of excavating, so this is what the site looked like with the Sahara off to the side. There's no rocks here, so this is all pottery. So he's got a city assembled out of different parts, and he's excavated a number of parts of that. So it's clearly an archaeological site with lots of specialists, particularly ceramic specialists. So he has a model that at a time in the middle of the first millennium BC, when the waters were higher, at the high water period, basically everyone either left seasonally or they lived on the two highest parts. So this would be, the light blue would be water level 4 meters above where the highest that it gets today. But at low water, which would be 2 meters above where it gets today, people dispersed off into their own individual communities. And he's finding communities of sheep and goat herders, distinct from the communities of cattle herders, distinct from the metallurgists, distinct from the ceramicists. So part of the year they're living together, but part of the year they're dispersing off into these, I like the word assembled or clustered, but let's use the word assembled towns. This is maybe what it looks like. Now, in my article that I gave you that quote from Richard Burton, the explorer of Central Africa, saying that these cities in Central Africa that were clearly cities, both in function and in size and in population, they're clearly cities, but to the untrained or the overly trained European eye, they look like a heap of huts. That was his classic quotes. So Tumbuz, which is what we're calling this town near Timbuktu, looks like a heap of huts, and yet it functions in size, numbers of people, and in its relationship to the hinterland, and that's the last part of all this as a true city. Certainly didn't look like a classic European or Mesopotamian city. So what is an assembled city? It's an evolving, functioning mosaic of purposes. I think that's what's going on certainly with Benin City and all those other Yoruba cities. We would love to know what was going on in the 12th century, so there's oral traditions for Benin City, but no archaeology from the 12th century. And also at Kerma, and that's the beauty of the Swiss excavations, going back to 6000, is they're starting to pick out the early parts of the city. And they're finding that the city just kind of blew up in size from a model that was already there. Okay, so lesson 2 is African cities grow organically and not to some Near Eastern template. Again, remember, it's the earlier archaeologists who were digging to a Near Eastern template, and they're not finding cities, and they're not finding the true diversity of cities because of those blinders that they came to the story with. So finally, how should Cisse look at the city's hinterland? Should Cisse's definition of the city include rural relations? Well, we have this idea that there should be a dichotomy between urban dwellers and rural dwellers because of a very, very European concept. And one of the very fine urban historians, Spyro Koptov, was talking about in the case of Siena, one of the Italian cities that he studied, that a well-governed city is separated by a wall from its countryside. So chaos is out in the countryside, wilderness is out in the countryside, order and and laws are behind the cities. Now that's simplistic, of course, but again, it's one of these conceptions that we brought from as part of the intellectual baggage that we brought from the 19th and 20th century to the study of cities, and I would assert that's one of the reasons why we haven't recognized really what was going on with African cities. So let's look at the hinterland. And here we're going to go to the Middle Niger. So here's the Niger River, and one of its tributaries. Right at the meeting of the tributaries is Djenné, the town that I started with, and the older town that goes back to 500 BC called Djenné. Timbuktu is on the Niger River, and actually Gao is right about there. As we do survey from Djenné to Timbuktu, up into the Sahara, down the hinterland of Timbuktu, and following all those paleo channels up into the Sahara, particularly in this area right here, which is where I first encountered Al-Qaeda. It's why I can't excavate it at my site right now, but that will change. I will get back to my site. But that area, we're finding thousands and thousands, not just cities, but city clusters, and I'll show you why I make that distinction. But just to give you an idea, we think now geomorphologically that the Middle Niger, so this is what the Middle Niger might have been, maybe as late as the first millennium BC, but certainly third millennium BC. This was an area of annual flooding. So basically a very extensive floodplain. 3000 BC, at least 170,000 square kilometers, and the Middle Niger, much shrunk, 55,000 square kilometers, but compare that to the annually flooded areas of Mesopotamia and Egypt. So it's in some ways amazing that earlier colonial period archaeologists didn't go to this very large floodplain, very wealthy floodplain, wealthy in stock, but also in grain. And why they didn't imagine that these mounds that they saw topping up above the waters covered in potsherds weren't cities as well. But there was, again, one of these blocks, these intellectual blocks. So that's the Middle Niger right now. Okay, so this is the mound of Djenné. It's a kilometer north-south by about 800 meters, 7 meters high. And I've been working there since 1977. And this is what we do. We put big holes. This is 6 meters by 10 meters. This is one of my Malian co-directors. I get a crew of about 60 people. So remember when I talked about Gertrude Caton Thompson and the backfill piles? Here are our backfill piles. I would challenge anyone to find a single potsherd in my backfill piles, because we do screen, excavation techniques have changed a bit. But we dig, so you see all the layers. We dig layer by layer by layer by layer. So this is 1400. So we're right about at the time of Christ. That took 8 months to excavate. And we've got another 2.5 meters to get to about 500. It's going to take us 2 months just to backfill with a reduced crew, but just to backfill these holes. So at this point, I've put 28 of these holes into the town of Djenné. But I joke about putting telephone booths into this town. The tell, is so massive that even a 6 by 10 looks dwarfed by the size. So what have we found? Number one, no king. We certainly went in the 70s expecting to find a citadel, expecting to find monuments. No hierarchy. We expected to find some kind of reflection of a hierarchical state-like community, which is not to say that they're not making high-value commodities. So from about 8,400 to about 600, about 17% of the pottery, all the pottery that's made, has fugitive colors. So in other words, the pot is fired, and then they paint the colors on it. It's like the Delftware. You can't use it. All of that pottery is evenly distributed amongst all of the houses. Houses of pastoralists, houses of fishermen, houses of blacksmiths. Not to say that there wasn't some kind of a distribution of wealth, unequal distribution of wealth, but not on the order that certainly we had expected. Certainly we expected to find some kind of a king, some kind of advanced chief, and to this point, we haven't. So I'll trot out the standard joke. If the next time I get to Jenny Genoa and put in one of those holes and we come down on the chief, then I'll have to burn all of the articles I've ever written. I'll have to rip up my 13 books and commit suicide, because I basically committed my career to this idea that there's an alternative to having a city without a citadel. So these little dots represent the different units that we put in. These are boreholes, kind of just to give us an idea of what the stratigraphy is like. But each of these represent a different excavation from a different season. If you've ever played whack-a-mole, just imagine you're pushing, it's not proportionally horizontal and vertically, but each of the vertical, we're pushing the excavations, going meticulously through the millefeuille stratigraphy at these different parts of the mound in order to try to sample the different parts of the community. So in other words, if you're hierarchically inclined, you're going to look for the citadel, you're going to look for the palace, you're going to look for the temple. If you think something else is going on, that's a more diverse population, then you've got to do something like this, get a better sample of what's going on. But it is a classic tell. You can see the stratigraphy here. It's classic tell, like in Mesopotamia, built up in the same way. People would go out into the floodplain, dig up the mud, the alluvium, make their bricks, bring it into the town, and with the rains, it only gets about 750 millimeters of rain a year, but in very short rainy season. So houses melt. In about 20 years, they melt. People abandon them. When they come back to occupy that area, they just raise the area and build on top of it. They want to be above the annual floods, so the higher they can be. So it's a classic tell, like we find in Mesopotamia. But this is our excavation technique. This is my Hell's Angel. Found him, reformed him by bringing him out to West Africa. Most meticulous excavator I've ever worked with. But Carroll is near an archaeological treasure. Anyone want to guess what this is? This feature here. Archaeologists love these. It's a latrine. Why do archaeologists love latrines? Because people bury their secrets in latrines. We love it when we find latrines. So just a couple of shots of the excavation. This is Balkasu, who's my foreman for 32 years at this point. Can excavate better than I can. So some of the burials. Our neighbor girl is showing one of the gold earrings that we found from about 800 BC. Have a number of these statuettes, and there's a certain tradition, historical tradition, that says if you have terracotta statuette production, there has to be centralized production. There has to be a king. There's no evidence whatsoever that there was a king or any kind of centralized production. Great variety of these things. I understand on Friday that you're going to the art gallery in the Africa floor, the second floor. You'll see a number of looted statuettes, but we're finding them as well. Now we do have a city wall. And one would say, oh, then there had to be defense and strife, and you had to have a king to organize the defense of the cities. There's no evidence whatsoever, as opposed to the Senegal, where I excavate, where there's plenty of evidence for rape, pillage, burning, and all those things that archaeologists have a certain skill to find. No evidence whatsoever in the 1500-year progression of Jenny Genoa. This is probably a revetment. to keep the floodwaters of the high annual flood from flooding into the town itself. One of the things we do see is advanced craftsmanship. Let me kind of run through these. So right from the very beginning, we have iron. It's actually not iron. It's true steel. It's 0.3% and purposely made steel, the 0.3% carbon steel. Europe, of course, doesn't have that until 1854 with the Bessemer process. So they had essentially discovered the Bessemer process. This is from about 300 BC. This is one of the furnaces. I haven't cleared it out yet, but there's a antechamber for controlling, basically controlling the carbon monoxide and the carbon content of the air coming into the chamber. And we have a whole this is about 800 AD, the whole blacksmith's atelier, a workshop with smithing furnaces, 1, 2, 3. There's one of my beloved latrines right outside of the, and right here, it's a little bit hard to see, there's a male-female statuette pair buried into the wall. So I'm much more inclined to say that these statuettes are not part of a state religion, but they're familiar. They're household gods and goddesses that are part of the different groups occupying the town. So here's Geni Geno here, but you see it's not alone. Now 3 kilometers away is Geni, and there's the mosque. But you can see the waters are coming down. Everything that's green here are rice fields. But you can see these other tells popping up above the waters. So surrounding Geni and Geni Geno are 72 other tells within a 4-kilometer radius, and they're occupied at the same time, and I'm arguing that they function as a cluster, that they function as an assembled city. So here's another shot, Geni Geno. So shallow swamp fishermen exclusively occupied this site here. Blacksmiths occupied this site. This is kind of a lobal site here. No evidence of any kind of occupation, but there are lots and lots of statuettes, lots and lots of what we think are altars. So it's kind of a ritual area. Now you would think, why not on the Mesopotamian model, all agglomerate, come in together, build a city wall around yourself, rather than having this clustered organization. Well, that's I think the value of digging different kinds of cities, because you get to ask those different questions. The satellite sites certainly change through time. So here's a blacksmith site. Once it's abandoned in the 12th century, then it's taken over as a cemetery. So these are burial urns. They're between 1 and 5 people crammed into each of these urns. So very laborious to try to figure out what's going on. About 5 minutes? Okay, that'll work. Very laborious. So every mound here in red has at least one excavation, 22 at Geni Geno. And all of the mounds have been thoroughly surface surveyed. We collect the material to try to get an idea, at least at the end of occupation, what was going on at the sites. Here's basically what's going on. There's very little oral tradition except for this site. So blacksmiths living in town today said, oh yes, that's our ancestors' sites. They were deep water fishermen and blacksmiths at the same time. That's very, very rare, and the blacksmithing was probably more to make occult power than to make iron. But so in the few cases where we have present oral tradition, it kind of fits with this idea that was more or less exclusive occupation by different occupation groups at the different types. So we go back to Tel Brak, and the Tel Brak of the period of the Harvard excavations and Jason Orr. And he started off excavating the town itself, kind of on the Nippur model, and finishing up with David and Joan Oates. But then he starts to look at, he goes to the hinterland, and he starts to surface collect, and he starts to find collections of, or higher densities of sherds from different periods. And then he does the modern kind of chemical analyses that we can do of the archaeological soils. Archaeological soils have a lot of phosphorus in them, because they're cattle and humans that are peeing all the time. So it's one of the ways that Scandinavian archaeologists find temporary camps of Vikings. They may have been there for only one season or only a couple, but they're peeing there all the time. So it's just they pick it up with the phosphate analysis. So Jason has a very, very different sense of what's going on at Ur than David and Joan. So we go to China very, very quickly. Shandong province, place that shouldn't have had, outside of the central basin of the Yellow River, shouldn't have had early cities. We've got this very, very early city, 2,800 BC, in the Neolithic, not even in the Bronze Age. And sure enough, it's one of these assembled cities. There's no city wall, no central focus of the city, which is going to be the signature of the Chinese city later on, but different craft places, locales that function. I mean, certainly the argument that Anne Underhill from here is making is that they function as a city. So lesson 3, how does Cisse define the city? It's a grunt definition of a city, of an ancient city. It's one that archaeologists can deal with. A large settlement, not saying how large. With a heterogeneous population, we don't have to specify how heterogeneous, or a heterogeneous tapped by a king. That provides a variety of services and manufacturers to a larger hinterland. Those are the things that archaeologists can find. We can find the city and the hierarchy of cities, small towns, medium towns, small towns, and villages that go along a continuum of, you'll find blacksmiths probably in every kind of settlement in West Africa, but you'll only find goldsmiths in the cities. But when you find the gold from the town in the villages, you know they have some kind of a relationship. So when you take that kind of a definition, it looks very, very different than our old way of looking at cities. So what has the African experience told us about cities writ large? First of all is you may have kings, and kings are a nice thing to have when you have enemies pounding on your gates, but you don't necessarily have to have kings. And those manifestations of kings, like city walls and citadels, are the things that were our proxies for the despotic organization of society, don't necessarily have to be found. The bad part, of course, of despotism and of kings is that kings are always going off and raiding other cities and bringing back the slaves. So remember, if there's a tendency to glorify ancient cities, much of the labor that was involved in producing the goodies were produced by unfree labor. Rome and Athens not accepted. I'm not saying that there wasn't slavery in Gennaro, but we have absolutely no evidence of that from the oral traditions, from the Arab sources, or from the archaeology. Question? Okay, almost there. The city is not isolated. You need to understand the hinterland, and it won't do just to dig the palace structure and the temple structure. If you believe something else is going on with the population, you have to have a sampling excavation strategy that will show you that. So, why study African cities? At the very beginning, I talked about this idea of original civilizations. Only 6 where you had urbanism showing up without any evidence of sort of cross-pollination. Now, I know this, for many archaeologists, this is a way outdated idea, but many of these issues are taken from very recent textbooks, high school textbooks. This being one, kind of showing what they're talking about. The Andean civilization, Mesoamerican civilization, we accept that they were original urban civilizations. No, the older thought that there was cross-pollination. We just don't get that. Egypt, well, I mean, yeah. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, North China, 6. Diffusion. So the older idea was anything good you find out of Southeast Asia is diffused out of China. Anything good that you find in West Africa is diffused out of Egypt, and we're just not finding that. Not one Egyptian faience bead, not one Phoenician coin, not one Roman coin in all of the excavations that we've done. So, just to end up, this is the cover of another one of the textbooks. Again, the 6 civilizations. So, to be facetious, I think we can change that cover to at least add one more original civilization. And I would say probably many, many more in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa and in Southeast Asia. And certainly we know from some of the graduate students here on the Amazonian slip side of the Andean slip side of the Amazonian side. Thank you very much.